Hello everybody, my name is Spoons Rattling. Today we are doing a video where we are not ranking all the Space Marines as you see here, but rather their vehicles, their tanks specifically. So anything that's tracked or has hover plates for the primaris vehicles, their role in the army, where I think they fit in if they have a place, and also their future in the range on the whole. So let's get into it. First up, we have the Razerback. Now the Razerback, like content-wise, is certainly one of my favorite tanks. Though I think it isn't super strong right now for the main reason that it just simply lacks things to transport. It is rather efficient at transporting Devastators, just because of the synergy of the squad size and the size of the vehicle. But Devastators on the whole aren't super strong right now, even though Devastators in a Razorback is one of my favorite things visually. It's not something I would run to be super strong, though in terms of flavor points it at least gets some very solid points there. However, I think if we're rating it purely on its own strength, it's going to end up probably in C tier. Not that I think it's completely unusable, I think that Devastators inside of it can pack a good anti-tank punch, but it is more so a middling to weaker unit. Next up we have the Predator Annihilator, if I'm not mistaken. I always get these two mixed up, but it's the las cannon variant of the Predator. So the Predator Annihilator comes with one super powerful anti-tank shot on its main gun, and then the two sponson mounted ones. Its damage, it gets to reroll ones on its damage rolls, which is a nice little consistency boost, but overall it does sort of lack in the amount of attacks. However, it does have the benefit of not being terribly expensive. It doesn't come in at more than 130 points. If I'm not mistaken, it might be 140 points. Let me just double check while we're live. But overall, I think it's not an awful choice, but it is sort of outcompeted by some of its grav tank cousins in terms of anti-tank firepower. But though it is more durable than them, just given its cheaper points cost at only 130 points, I was correct. It does have pretty solid consistency with its damage, especially if you attack something that is the Oath of Moment, because then you'll be re-rolling the hit roll and wound roll on that big Strength 14 gun, which will be very efficient at wounding enemies. Though again, as I mentioned, I think it's slightly outcompeted by some of its grav-plated cousins, though I don't think it's a bad option. I'd give it a B, sort of a B, maybe a B minus. The main thing is it's just not super powerful, really. Though, again, I don't think it's a bad choice. More so just middle of the road. And here's something I didn't mention with the Razorback, but I'll mention now. I played through Space Marine 2, of course, and I noticed that on the Loyalist side, there was a lot of Rhinos and Rhino Chassis seen throughout the campaign, both on the maps and in the battle barge, which makes me think the Rhino... I actually think I was wrong. I don't think the Rhino is going away. I think it will be co-opted by the Primaris, much like the Land Raider was this edition. Next edition, even though next edition is likely the end of any firstborn models for infantry in the range. So I think that the future for these Rhino Chassis tanks is actually rather bright, and I'm quite happy about that because I think the Rhino is very cool. Next up we have the Predator Destructor. The Predator Destructor has a big autocannon and then can carry either of the sponsons, though I would usually bring the las cannon. Its autocannon is very good against most kinds of infantry. It's strength 9, AP 2, and damage 3 against infantry, which is always a solid profile for dueling with most things, and it's long range with rapid fire 2, which of course helps it deal with things that rely on their toughness and also things that deal on their wounds or save. It's just in general very effective against light all kinds of infantry and also light vehicles. Things like storm speeders or sentinels, death dreads, things like that will really not want to be shot by this thing just because its weapon is generally effective against their type of defense. Overall, I'd say I'd probably put it above the Annihilator just because the Destructor is overall a lot more flexible than the Annihilator is, as the Annihilator is very railroaded into anti-vehicle damage, but the autocannon plus las cannons configuration will be able to deal with all kinds of infantries. The autocannon can chip most vehicles, and the las cannons are las cannons, always effective. Next up we have the Repulsor Executioner, which acts as a sort of gunboat for the Primaris. It has a small transport capacity and a large suite of weapons that helps it deal with light infantry and also heavy infantry if you bring the plasma cannon, or vehicles with its laser destroyer. I think overall it's a solid enough vehicle. I would probably put it in a similar tier to the Destructor, as they share some similarities, funnily enough. They're both really pretty tough, relying mainly on their toughness for that toughness, which is a very strange sentence, but I'm sure you know what I mean. But they also pack a solid suite of weaponry, being able to attack most targets efficiently, especially if you bring the big laser destroyer, which is very good against vehicles, and then you can bring things like heavy bolters, and then the repulsor defensive array is very solid. Next up, we have the Demolisher. So the Demolisher is usually more seen on the Demolisher. That's not the name. Vindicator. It's a Demolisher cannon that it carries. It is rather expensive, though it does have the benefit of a nice save. And it's still toughness 11, so it's no chump. You'll need real anti-tank damage to deal with it. And the Demolisher cannon is pretty famous for being a very general-purpose weapon, which most weapons aren't. It can shoot in combat for free, and overall, it's, I'd say, a pretty solid gun sort of turret, though I think it is actually outcompeted by the Predators, in my opinion. Mainly because the Predator Destructor is, in general, already pretty general purpose, and also can fire from much further away, while also moving a little bit faster, which does make it more useful for other roles. And while the 2+ save and higher toughness is nice, it is still 175 points. That's almost as much as a repulsor, which is certainly a lot tougher. I think it falls into B tier, though. It's not bad. It may just be outclassed by some of its contemporaries. Next up, we have the Vanilla Land Raider. The Vanilla Land Raider is the middle child of the Land Raider family, having the sort of blend of the lowest transport capacity, but also the biggest guns in terms of dealing with tanks, which is useful, mainly because it'll be transporting melee units, which may not be able to take care of tanks very efficiently. It's got a big transport capacity at 12 models, and of course, can transport Terminators, which is always a useful ability for a transport to have, which means it can transport pretty much everything in the Space Marine Army. It is decently fast at 10 inches, and is very tough at toughness 12 with a 2+ save and 16 wounds. I quite like the normal Land Raider, though I do think it, I don't think it really struggles for a place in the army either, given the fact that it's just this big, bulky, tough unit that can transport anything you need. It's definitely more melee slanted, thanks to the assault ramp rule, which lets units charge out of it after moving, a huge boon to Terminators, and definitely one of my favorite tanks, and definitely one of the best tanks in the whole army. In fact, I think that goes for most of the Land Raiders. Now, the Rhino I'm going to put in probably top of C tier, where the Rhino's a C-, this is a C+. The Rhino, the Razerback rather, is a C-, and the Razerback is C-, Rhino is C+, is what I'm trying to say. The Rhino sort of lacks anything too valuable to transport outside of a faction like Space Wolves, which still has a good amount of firstborn units. I think the Rhino there can at least transport something like Blood Claws, which are quite fighty in melee, and it would be a nasty little melee bomb to come out of this little Rhino, which isn't too bad. And the Rhino is, of course, very cheap, and in general, nice and durable for its cost. It regenerates a wound. It doesn't have the best suite of weapons, but, it really lacks compared to the Chaos version specifically. But it still packs a Hunter Killer Missile, which most of the Firstborn tanks can do, which is a nice little bit of a very, very unlikely to do anything anti-tank shot. But, it can transport a lot of those Firstborn units if you're playing something like Space Wolves, which I think gives it a place, at least there, if you aren't just using Storm Wolves. Which I think is totally valid. There's plenty of Space Wolves collectors that have lots of Blood Claws and stuff like that wouldn't mind using a Rhino. But again, it just lacks something super dangerous to transport. It doesn't have like a Chaos Chosen, like something the Chaos have. Next up, we have the Whirlwind. Now, the Whirlwind is pretty awful. I think it is extremely, extremely overcosted for very mediocre indirect fire, which is already very nerfed because it is indirect fire. And while it would be solid anti-infantry shooting, there's just not much reason to bring it at that points cost, as I believe you can get a repulsor for that cost, and a normal repulsor offers much more durability, as well as overall better anti-infantry shooting, which is the main thing. You can get the Gatling cannon, you get the The missile, you get your default defensive array. The Whirlwind is just super expensive, and indirect fire is not very good this edition, which I generally way prefer to indirect fire being even slightly good. And the Whirlwind is not a unit that makes indirect fire work. Next up, we have the Land Raider Crusader, which is the cheapest of the Land Raiders, which also makes it the toughest. And that's always, of course, nice to have, though it does, of course, come at that rock bottom price of 220 points for a reason, as it only has Hurricane Bolters. Now, this is not a slight against Hurricane Bolters, because they're very good. You do get 2 of them, so you get an absolute annihilating amount of close combat firepower. And honestly, I think that's a very solid thing to have, especially if you're using it to transport something like normal Terminators who can bring chain fists to help them deal with normal vehicles if that's a serious issue for the unit you're transporting. But it is also nice to run something this tough for that cheap, especially if you're transporting something like Deathwing Knights, which are very expensive, and this thing is way cheaper than they are, so you're getting a really good value of this nice defensive bubble that gives them extra speed, while also allowing them to charge out of it on turn 2, which will allow them to get to combat significantly more consistently than anywhere else. I think that most of the Land Raiders are very good, and I'm putting this right next to the other one. Next up, we have the normal Repulsor. Now, the normal Repulsor is pretty tough, not quite as tough as a Land Raider, but it's also cheaper than a Land Raider, by about 40 points in the case of the Crusader. It comes with a suite of sort of anti-infantry and a little bit of anti-tank firepower, though nothing to really write home about in that regard. It's just a couple of las talon and las cannon shots that won't win any awards, but is useful to have, and I think slants more towards transporting shooting units than melee units because those shooting units tend to pack a little bit more, obviously, ranged firepower. This has a big transport capacity. It's very good for transporting something like Hellblasters if you're running a big unit of them, though I don't think it's necessarily bad for transporting assault units, though maybe it'd be better for mixed role and shooting rather than pure assault units. Overall, I think the Repulsor earns its place in A tier. Right, probably a little bit higher than the Repulsor Executioner, mainly just because it does its job as a transport better, though the Executioner would of course act as a better gun turret than this one would. Next up we have the Repulsor, which is the mini transport for the Primaris Marines, and I think it does its job very well. It can transport 7 models, so any of these small melee elite squads can fit in here with a character just fine. It's decently tough. It comes with that invulnerable save with its bubble shield, and overall it's pretty solid in terms of shooting, as it can bring along, its storm bolters, it can have a heavy stubber, and then of course, you will of course bring the shield dome just to make it really, really tough for the cost, because then it'll be, 80 points for 11 wounds, 3 plus 5 plus, toughness 9, very solid. And in terms of transporting valuable units, this is probably your best bet, just because of, how cheap it is, and the fact that it's good for transporting small units very solidly. Overall, I think this one also earns its place in probably near the top of A tier, just because so many 6-man units are powerful. Things like Blade Guard or Inner Circle Companions really appreciate having this to jump out of. Next up, we have the Gladiator tanks. First up is the Gladiator Valiant, who I think is quite bad. The Gladiator Valiant sort of lacks a role in the army. Its anti-vehicle damage is rather mediocre, and doesn't really do much else to sort of justify itself compared to its other Gladiator compatriots in the Executioner, or the, Lancer and Reaper. Which I think is what mainly hurts the Gladiator Valiant, mainly just because, it's supposed to do anti-vehicle duties, but its highest strength is only 10, which means it's really limited to hunting things like Carnifexes or smaller Dreadnought-type vehicles, which in general you can get double duty on with your Lancers or something like that. And speaking of, we have the Gladiator Lancer, which I think the Gladiator Lancer is probably... You know what? I think I'm going to reshuffle. No, I think I am. I'm going to put these 3 up here, and then I'm going to put the Lancer up here as well. I think the Lancer, even as expensive as it is, which makes it quite fragile for the cost, is certainly very powerful, just because that laser destroyer is so innately powerful. It's not going to be doing much aside from that, but a battery of them will generally cover your anti-vehicle needs for an entire army, just because of how powerful the Lancer Laser Destroyer is. It's good in several detachments, and in general brings, while not super good toughness, it brings decent toughness in that giant gun to it that's very consistent given its reroll ability, as well as the, of course, things like Oath of Moment. So bringing along one or two of these is going to be a great way to patch an anti-tank hole in your army, which Space Marines, in some regards, can struggle with outside of things like the Gladiator Lancer, which does help them have good anti-tank. Next up, we have the Gladiator Reaper, which I think the Reaper sort of falls more so into B tier, where it's not bad, but more so of a niche choice than anything else. It does have a very solid anti-infantry gun, though it is rather pricey for that role alone. The devastating wounds do help it punch up, especially with twin linked. You definitely can get some solid chip damage, but overall, I say it's more of something that if you need in your army, bring it along, but is not something I would generally build around. It would be more of an auxiliary unit rather than a sort of sole unit that would be carrying part of the army. Next up, we have one of the two remaining resin vehicles for the Space Marines. We have the Astrius, which is the primaris super heavy tank, which packs quite a few guns, unsurprisingly, that have a variety of sort of abilities. You can give it a couple of las cannon equivalents, or you could give it a big plasma guns. Unfortunately, I think with the Astrius, well, for its cost, it's not necessarily too bad defensive. It's not fantastic, but not bad. It's sort of let down by its main gun, which is the big autocannon, which just doesn't do enough damage to vehicles for it to really be worth it. And its special rule is rather mediocre, just giving out a -1 to hit, and of course, in certain situations, it could really struggle to move across the board, which would definitely be a problem. And I just wish its main cannon was more powerful to make it a more interesting choice, which I think sort of earns it a top of C tier probably is where I'd put the Astrius, which makes sense. The big resin kits generally are kept rather tame in terms of power, as when they do get too powerful, it can be rather toxic for the game and make the game unfun, because these things are A, hard to put together, and B, very expensive money-wise, even more so than any other unit in 40k is. And then next up, we have the Blood Angels exclusive, the Batt Predator, and the Batt Predator got quite the glow-up in its Codex upgrade, with all of its weapons gaining Assault, which means it can advance basically for free every turn, and with its reroll advance moves, it practically has a 15-inch move. Well, turn 1 you probably won't want to advance just to fire off its Hunter-Killer missile. The rest of the turns it is completely free to advance, which makes it a very solid secondary unit, funnily enough, because it's so fast and generally tough. It's not something like a unit of Space Marines where dedicating a decent chunk of anti-infantry can take them out. This you do need to dedicate actual anti-vehicle fire to. It is the cheapest out of all the Predator variants, and if you equip it with the Flamestorm cannon and the couple of heavy flamers, you will have a very serious Overwatch threat that is very good at clearing out infantry, which it will do very well, and then it can take objectives just as well, given how it's a vehicle that moves fast and has OC3, which means it is no slump on objectives, and I would definitely put this vehicle in A tier, right up alongside the Destructor, just because it's cheap, tough, and it does its job fantastically. Finally, we have the Land Raider Crusader, or Redeemer rather, and I'm going to put this alongside the other ones, but probably a bit lower, mainly because the Redeemer has the hardest job out of all of the Land Raiders. It's the most expensive, given how annihilating its Flamestorm cannons can be, and in general will need to not only make use of its transport capacity, which is slightly larger than the normal, but it needs to make good use of its damage. So it can't really just fill the role of an assault transport, because then it needs to go off and deal significant damage to the rest of your army, because whatever you put in this, chances are it's going to be more expensive than the units it's transporting, which is not what you want in a transport. However, its damage is still strong enough that I think it's actually, I'm going to drop it down to the repulsor tier. I think it is simply very, very expensive, and for what it does, which is a lot of damage, it sort of needs to do a lot for your army, which makes it less easy to use than some of the top tier options in my opinion. However, I don't think it's too bad, and in general I think the Space Marine vehicles are probably at their best that they've ever been in most of 40k's history, especially things like the Predators, which have had a pretty long history of being rather mediocre. Anyways, I've been Spoons Rattling. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you all next time.